Hello, and a big warm welcome to the Guardian Doula's Diary podcast. My name is Angela Deuce, or Angie. I'm your host and the founder of Guardian Doula. I'm a certified birth and postpartum doula and childbirth educator based on Sydney's Northern Beaches and serving women and their families all throughout Sydney. This podcast is an honest collection of the stories and experiences of birthing women and the professionals that support them to empower, equip, and inspire us all. Let's get into it. Today's episode is how to have a VBAC. In case you're unfamiliar with that term, VBAC stands for Vaginal Birth After Cesarean. So I chatted to Sammy Griffin in this episode, who is a doula in Brisbane that mainly focuses on VBAC, and we'll talk about what the odds are of you having a VBAC according to the statistics, and we'll chat over some of the things that can get in the way of women having a VBAC that we recommend just getting really well educated on if you're planning one, and then we'll go over all of our tips to give yourself the best possible chance at having a VBAC. This episode is actually a bit of a follow-on from my last week's episode, which was episode 17. It was titled My Client's Physiological VBAC Birth Story, where my past client Amber shared her redemptive, empowering, beautifully positive VBAC experience. So I wanted to follow on from that episode with a really good practical, how can I make that happen episode. So that's what today is. But go and listen to episode 17 after this if you haven't already, because it's a really great story and it will get you excited and it will just fill you with hope at what is possible. But before today's episode starts, I really quickly want to do a disclaimer. If you know me, you know that I kind of hate disclaimers because I feel like they should just be common sense. But nonetheless, I want to emphasize that none of this is to be taken as medical advice. This is purely just information, and the references will be included in the show notes if you want to look into our resources and our where we got all the information from, which I highly recommend. But without further ado, let's get started. Do you want to just kick us off, Sammy, and just give us a little bit of context as to who you are and your claim to fame? I know you are the queen of VBAC. I feel like you're the VBAC doula queen up in Brisbane. But
no, I'm not. So I always say I've had one VBAC and I've had my experience, and I've supported many women in their VBACs. And what I've learned is one VBAC is very different to all the other VBACs.
Yeah.
And so I don't claim to be an expert in anything. And I just think I've had one experience, but the woman giving birth, she's the expert in her birth every time. I learn something at every birth. And I think that's an important point to make as well.
Yeah.
So I am from Brisbane. I live with my husband and 2 kids. I was in education and worked in a social justice area for about 10 years. And so then when I had my first baby, I realized, whoa, not only do we have a huge issue with our refugee asylum seeking population, but our maternal, the whole maternal industrialized, medicalized system is on fire. And so then my passion really stemmed and grew and went into that space.
I love that. So good. Mm-hmm. And then I guess for anyone listening who has come from your kind of world, I'll do a really quick intro as well, just in case that's helpful. So I'm Angie. I am also a birth doula. I have 4 little kids and I've been a doula for about 5 years. I am from Sydney and love it. I just absolutely love to help women have the most beautiful birth experiences and to come out of birth so on fire and empowered and just so amazed at their strength. I think that's my favorite thing is helping women see how strong they are, how capable they are, and it's such a joy and such a privilege. I think I come at this with a place of serious passion and I think it's, you were touching on before, the maternity system doesn't cater very well to the needs of women, which is unfortunate, but I do really love and find so rewarding that we as doulas get to be part of improving women's odds and their experiences, and we'll talk about the research and how doula support massively improves birth outcomes, which is so beautiful. Keen to chat all things VBAC.
Yes, it is my favourite topic. I honestly, because So the Australian maternity system at the moment is at a huge crossroads where we have a whole big population of first-time mums having primary cesareans.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are now going, oh, I don't actually know if that was my body, or was that actually failure to progress, or was that an induction that I shouldn't have had at 39 weeks? And then they start to question, but when they start to question, we have been living under the patriarchy for our whole lives, and we've been conditioned to be good girls, and we're told that having a VBAC is a really dangerous thing to do. Actually, I saw Jane Hardwick Collins, and this will be my first big VBAC tip. If you don't know her, you need to go and read 10 Moons. She's a midwife who had a VBAC in the 80s at home, and she's just so influential and amazing. So her book 10 Moons was a huge part of my VBAC journey. And I went to see her, and I went to see her at a women's circle. And she said, women who have VBACs are very dangerous females for two reasons, right? Dangerous in the way that you are disrupting the system. You're not being a good girl. You're going against the doctors in a lot of cases, the midwives, and also your mum, society. Go into any Facebook mothers group and you'll hear, I'd never do that. My doctor said it was too dangerous. Just dangerous females, I'm here for it. Love it.
Yeah. It's so, I mean, what you were touching on then about the sort of societal views and pressures around like, oh, why would you have a VBAC? Why would you put yourself under that risk? Why would you put your baby under that risk? It drives me nuts because it's people in the peanut gallery that actually have no idea about birth or about safety or about what the evidence says. Whereas really the truth of the matter is that most of the time, or at least a lot of the time, for women who are generally quite healthy and you know have like low risk pregnancies, VBAC is actually a lot safer than having an elective cesarean. And people just don't know that. They think cesarean's so much safer, but really if you are looking at the profile of risks, a repeat elective cesarean does carry with it usually a lot more risk than what a vaginal birth after cesarean would. So I'm really keen to empower women in this episode around how to make it happen, because you will be faced with a lot of pressure and you will be faced with a lot of controversy and, oh, well, why would you do that, and blah, blah, blah. And I totally agree with you, Sammy. Like there is this element of rebellion almost, which is ridiculous. Like it's honestly so stupid that that's even a thing, because it's a very reasonable thing to want to do, have a VBAC. Like it's very, very reasonable. It's actually safer for most women. And so yes, to your point, like there is a lot of pressure and a lot of opinion that will likely come as a result of you deciding to go for your VBAC. And I couldn't agree more. You've got to just not care what anyone else thinks, and you've got to remind yourself constantly they are probably uneducated and they haven't read a single study. You know, your Auntie Karen and your Uncle Bob, like they don't have a freaking clue.
That's right.
So you've got to be really careful about where you're getting your information. So I love that you've given that book a shout out. There's so many other resources, even like the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. I always encourage my clients to listen to that. You need to be listening to evidence, not public opinion.
Actually, the main person is the actual queen of VBAC, Dr. Hazel Keedle.
Yes.
And I would just say get the Birth After Cesarean book and listen to the Great Birth Rebellion episodes. Actually, you know what I used to do when I was preparing for my VBAC? I would just type Hazel Keedle into Spotify and I would just binge every episode she'd ever done on anything. And so there's a podcast called VBAC Stories Australia, I think, and it was the original VBAC podcast for Australians, and she was on one of their first episodes, and that is just golden nuggets everywhere. It is amazing. But you know, according to like RANZCOG, ACOG, Queensland clinical guidelines, VBAC is the safest mode of delivery after cesarean. And I think that's important for people to know, because the way women are counselled around VBAC is completely unethical and completely coercive in many cases. I've sat in some appointments and I cannot believe what I'm hearing. And then we go and bring a advocate from Maternity Choices Australia in for the next appointment, just so that everyone's on their best behaviour, because it's abuse, like it's obstetric abuse, what's happening in some of those appointments. So I just want to take a moment to just really give everyone that big cuddle if you've been going through this, because planning a VBAC and doing it in the system is a bloody hard slog.
Yeah. Yep. I can totally agree. I've sat through some appointments too where I've thought, like, there's actually blatant lying going on here. Like, there are statistics being manipulated. There are studies being quoted, and I'm like, I've read that study, and you're completely skewing those numbers. And I have confronted those. It's been obstetricians each time, and I've confronted them and said, like, hey, that's interesting, because I've actually read that same study, and those were not the stats. And I think it's funny as a doula, because you oftentimes are viewed as someone who is probably a little bit woo-woo and a little bit off with the fairies and a little bit like, oh, you're just some weird, I don't know,
I know,
or whatever.
Cheesecloth, get your drum out. But yeah.
But there is this really annoying misconception that doulas are, off with the fairies and we have no idea. And there are definitely doulas out there that have no idea, of course. Like with anything, there are obstetricians out there that are phenomenal.
Yes.
Just like there are doulas out there who are off with the fairies, but there are also doulas out there who eat evidence for breakfast, as I like to say. And it's interesting how quickly those appointments turn and how quickly the language changes as soon as there is like that accountability of like, oh, I've actually read that study. That's interesting. Can you show me where it says whatever, 2%? I thought it was 0.02%. And you see the like, oh, okay, maybe I should actually give facts here and not try and coerce and manipulate. And it's disgusting. It's exactly as you said. It is obstetric violence. And you don't need to look far to realize that this is a thing. You don't, like, there's just been the birth trauma inquiry. Like, it's a whole thing. It's a huge can of worms. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I feel like we should maybe pause and just give a little bit of context around what we're going to be covering today, so that we've got a little bit of a roadmap. So if you are listening, Sammy and I are going to be chatting about, we'll sort of do a part one just around the rates of VBAC. What is, I suppose, the likelihood of you getting your VBAC? What are the statistics? And I want to call that the reality versus the potential, because there's an amazing study that sort of explains what that should be and then what the stats are saying in Australia. So we'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about sort of in part two, I really want to unpack like why are the VBAC rates as low as they are? What's causing that? And then so there's a couple of things that Sammy and I, we were emailing before this, and there were a few things I was like, oh, we should talk about this and this and this. But I've also made a little list of some common hospital policies that are important to kind of just be aware of and get educated about. And obviously, as doulas, Sammy and I never give medical advice, but we sure as heck do give information, and we will be doing that in that section. We'll talk about what is kind of causing those really low rates of VBAC in Australia. And then part three, how to improve your odds. Like, what can you do to give yourself the best possible chance of VBAC? Because it is not, like, the low rates of VBAC are not a result of women not being able to give birth vaginally. Like, that is not why we have low rates of VBAC. When you look at other countries like the Netherlands, they have really, really sky high rates of VBAC, and it's not because the women there are different. Like, they're all human beings, we're all the same. It's that the way that the maternity care system works over there is far better suited to that outcome. And so we'll talk about all the things. I'm very excited. Shall we start with the very grim VBAC rates?
The VBAC rates, that's what you want to start with in Australia?
Yeah, I think it would be good to unpack like how many women who go to have their VBAC end up with that outcome. I think it's helpful to kind of understand what those statistics are, because I do think that there is a bit of a misconception that like, oh, if I just rock up to the hospital, surely I'll just get my VBAC. But unfortunately, that is not what statistically happens. And I think for a lot of women, it's helpful to know the environment that you're in. If you are, giving birth in this system, it's helpful to know what you're up against so that you can then use that information to make really helpful choices that are going to improve your odds. I always use the analogy of, if you were a boxer and you were going into the boxing ring, like those fighters are analyzing their opponent, and they go, I don't know, I hear my husband talk about it all the time. He loves UFC, and
so does mine.
He'll chat to his brothers or whoever else is watching it. all the time. And he's
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, so-and-so is versing so-and-so. And I think like he's going to be really working on his, I don't know what it's called, right hand jab, because he knows that the opponent always goes for the this and that kick. Like, obviously, I have no idea about UFC. I won't
Same.
pretend that I
No
do.
idea. But my
Not a
husband
clue.
loves it as well. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
good. But it's
Yeah.
this concept of getting to know your opponent, getting to know what you're up against. And if your opponent is notorious for those right hand jabs or whatever the heck they're called, you can then go, okay, great. My strategy, because of what I know now, is going to be X, Y, Z, and I'm more likely to win that fight, So I think it's just helpful to have a little bit of an understanding.
Well, I think we should start with the Cox study, which was released in 2016 then. So it was an Australian study done on women who've had a primary cesarean going for a VBAC at home. And he looked at 88 women, and 94% of them had a VBAC. So if you are someone planning a VBAC and you don't want to go to home, I would say probably what the most important part of that is, well, one, home, but the continuity of care with a known midwife would have played a huge part in that. I know for myself, that made everything so much better and easier, just having continuity of care. So, if we're looking at 94% of women, it's a small study, but it's still, I think it's amazing, can have a VBAC at home, then why is our VBAC rate 12% in Australia? A lot of people will cite, well, anyone who tries for a VBAC or plans a VBAC will have a 60 to 80% chance of that happening, right? Now, there's a real issue with like you going to your local obstetrician and they say, oh, I've actually got an 80% VBAC rate, because he or she doesn't have to include every woman who's ever had a cesarean before. They might have just had 10 really highly motivated women who just wouldn't get off their back banging on about this bloody VBAC, and out of those 10 women, 8 of them had VBACs. So then that doctor says, I've got an 80% VBAC rate. So you've got to be careful with the statistics that people are putting out there. And of course, there's going to be a huge population of women who had a really terrible time in their primary cesarean, because we know 2 out of 3 women are traumatized from their cesarean. So the overall birth trauma rate in Australia is 1 in 3, but in a cesarean, it's 2 in 3. And a lot of women will do anything not to have that experience again. So if that means having an elective cesarean, then they need to do that for their mental health.
Yes.
And I just think that is, I'm all for autonomy. If that is the choice you need to make, do it.
I love that.
I know what it's like to have a primary cesarean, and it sucks. And it flows onto every other part of your life and your motherhood journey. And it disrupts everything. The complete trust you have in your body, yourself, your mothering abilities, it can do that. And so there is going to be a big population of women who choose an elective cesarean. So, I don't know what you want to add anything to that, Ange?
Yeah, so I looked into the model of care specific sort of rates of women having VBACs, because I do really love what you were touching on about the importance of continuity of care. And I think that's true for so many reasons. My suspicion is that if you have chosen a care provider based on a really genuinely great VBAC rate, you trust this care provider, you feel that they are totally on board and supportive of your wish to have a VBAC, if that's what you wish for. And I love what you mentioned before about if you just feel like you cannot go there and it is far too distressing, or, just the thought of going for a VBAC is the last thing you want to do, then absolutely what you were saying, Sammy, about just deciding that an elective cesarean is your preference, good for you. It is all about autonomy, and it is all about the woman's freedom to choose, So I love, love, love that you called that out. But yes, model of care specific VBAC rates, let's unpack them, and all of the references for what we talk about I'm going to include in the notes. Before we go over the VBAC rates in each sort of model of care, I do want to call out that there's a really interesting study that was done that showed that when women are given the right conditions, VBAC should actually happen, 70 to 80% of the time is kind of the ideal, like what generally should be expected. But what we are seeing in Australia is, as Sammy said, in a public hospital setting, the rate of VBAC is around 12%. And then it's even lower in a private hospital setting, it's 4 to 8%. Whereas in a home birth setting or a birth center, we're seeing about 50% VBAC rates, which is incredible. So that just goes to show the difference that your model of care can make. So that's huge. I mean, yes, even that really good statistic of 50%, not 15, 50%, it's a great number, but it's still below that 70 to 80% figure that this study shows that it could be, right? So it's like we've still got work to do, but it's certainly a lot better than the lower end of that being like 4% in a private hospital. And also, it's not to say, like, if you were birthing in a private hospital, I've had so many clients over the years who have signed up at a private hospital, they've got their OB, whatever, and everything's locked in, and they kind of start to educate themselves a little bit, and they realize, like, oh, this is what I'm up against. Maybe this model of care actually wasn't super conducive to the outcome that I'm hoping to have, and they start to panic a little bit. But I do just want to encourage you, as much as it's ideal to really be careful about your model of care and to be really intentional about it, it doesn't mean that it's all over. Like, I literally just supported a woman who was going for a VBAC in a private hospital in an obstetrician-led model of care. And so the odds are stacked against her, right? But it's like she got her dream physiological VBAC. She had a water birth. She had the most incredible experience. And she puts it down to having gotten really well informed and really well prepared and having had a doula. So I do want to just call out, like, it doesn't mean that if you are in a private hospital that all hope is lost. Like, it's not necessarily lost.
No, absolutely. There are a couple of OBs up here in Brisbane who are really supportive of VBACs, and they are kind of where a lot of our women planning VBACs, they're kind of funneled into these couple of obstetricians for sure who, don't worry about water and or even continuous monitoring or cannula. Like, they're kind of the big ticket items that a lot of women planning VBACs don't want, because they probably had an induction where they had a cannula and they know what that feels like, and they feel like they can get that inserted really easily, and so they don't want to do that earlier in their labour. The CTG, well, of course, we know, if you've listened to the Great Birth Rebellion CTG episodes, that is having a flow-on effect into our hospitals in Brisbane, where the midwives will actually say, look, we need to, it's policy that we put this on you, but there's not a lot of evidence for it. So, the option is yours.
I'm so glad you touched on that, because I think that's huge. And it kind of brings us to this part 2 around, like, what is stopping VBAC in Australia? What is it that's kind of resulting in these lower rates of VBAC? And a huge one is hospital policies. And I'm so glad that you've touched on that, because I think there is certainly a few that are really helpful to be mindful of and to get educated on, so that when you show up to the hospital and I don't want to say inevitably, but like, you'll very likely be offered things like the continuous CTG monitoring and all sorts of other things. When those offers come, I think being really across what those things are, the likely flow-on effect that can happen. I've done a podcast episode before on the cascade of intervention and what that means. It's a term that most women do come across and they're familiar with it. But if you haven't heard of the cascade of intervention, really worth listening to that episode and kind of understanding this phenomenon that happens, where oftentimes one intervention will lead to a domino effect. But yes, let's break down some of these policies, because it is true, unfortunately, that not all hospital policies are based on good evidence, which is unfortunate. And I think, that's for a number of reasons. Some of it is just because there's a lot of red tape because of insurance companies. And, there is research that shows that it takes on average 17 years for really good quality research to then translate into hospital policy. So unfortunately, it's not true that when you rock up to the hospital to have your baby, unfortunately, you're not being given necessarily really good evidence-based care. It's you actually have to go and put in the effort to get really well educated, or you could hire a doula, or do both, even better, to make sure that you've got access to all of the information to make decisions that you're very comfortable with. And whether that decision, like we said before, is an elective cesarean or a physiological water birth, like whatever it is and wherever you sit on that spectrum of what you want, just get yourself informed so that your decision is one that you're really comfortable with and that you're really confident in. Do you want to share a little bit about the continuous monitoring? Because that's definitely one that I think is important to look out for, especially, as you said, like the Great Birth Rebellion podcast really unpacks that honestly, the main evidence to support it is if you are being induced. Like, that's really the only time that there's evidence to support that it does indeed improve outcomes for women and babies. But I don't know if you have any stories around that or...
The three things to look out for a uterine rupture are baby's heart rate, fresh blood, and mum's having pain, or the woman birthing is having pain in between contractions. Now, something important to note is I have heard again and again, because when I was planning my VBAC, I wanted to hear everyone's stories about rupture. So I was in the rupture groups on Facebook. I was in the special scars group on Facebook. I just wanted to hear what happened. Did they know? Now, I didn't read one story where that woman didn't know she was having a uterine rupture, but I did read a couple of stories where the CTG was fine, and so they left her and said, no, it's just, we'll get you an epidural. And they didn't listen to her because of the bloody CTG. It was fine. And then we go in 4 hours later and Bub's not okay, right? So I think, some women will want CTG and that will feel like a safety thing for them. And so again, all for autonomy. For me personally, I wanted them to listen to me. So I said to my midwife, if I tell you something's wrong, I want you to wheel me into theatre. I don't want you to check a monitor. I want to have a cesarean. Because I was so connected to my intuition. I'd done so much work and I knew if something had happened, I would know. And so that was, that's the reason why I personally didn't want a CTG and didn't have one. But a lot of women have had a CTG in their primary births, and they know the restrictions that it caused, and they know that they had to stand still, and they couldn't, it kept dropping out, and then everyone freaks out because they didn't get a read for 10 minutes or whatever. They had to hop out of the bath because it wasn't working in the bath. So all of these restrictions then come on. So it's a mobility thing. It's, for me, it's so unreliable. So just go and listen to those Great Birth Rebellion episodes, or otherwise, Birth Small Talk, is that her blog? Dr. Small's blog, I think it is. And she's got it's been going for years and years and years. I remember reading it when I was first doing this in 2018. I was reading her blogs and, the evidence has been there for a long time from her perspective. And then we've got the cannula on arrival, right? And that, again, it's just, how bad are you at your job if you can't put one in an emergency? That kind of, I don't want to be that person, but honestly, like, if there is an emergency, you're going to have to just put one in quickly, and but it can be so distracting for labours.
Absolutely. And on the cannula one, I have had so many experiences where, because the cannula is in, there are comments like, oh, we may as well give you some syntocinon to speed this up. And so while I do completely appreciate the thought behind, well, if there's an emergency, we'd like faster access, I can understand the rationale there. But for a woman who is uncomfortable with the idea of having a cannula, number one, like what you were saying about mobility and about comfort is massive. Like, it might sound like it's not a big deal. Even what you touched on around the continuous CTG monitoring, having to stand still and having to, can you move your position? Can you get out the bath? We can't get a good read on baby's heart rate. That may not sound like it would actually be that much of a big deal, but having been around a lot of birth, like, I'm telling you, that throws a woman off. And not only does it throw a woman off because now she's changing positions, she can't listen to what her instincts are telling her, which is a huge part of labor going smoothly, is listening to your body and to be really in tune with what your body's asking for. But also the emotional detriment that happens when a midwife says, we can't get a good trace, or we're not really hearing baby's heart rate. Like, that is terrifying. If you're in labor and all of a sudden baby's heart rate's dropped off, I'm sorry, but my instant thought is going to be like, is my baby alive? Like, that's where my brain would go, and that's where women's brains go. And I've seen it happen time and time and time again. So it is significant. It might sound like, we'll toughen up. Honestly, it's just, we're only asking you to stand still, or we're only asking you to get out the bath. It's not a big deal. Even comments like, you're having a baby. Like, surely you can just get out the bath. You're in labor, for goodness sake. It's not that uncomfortable. Like, no, don't undermine.
That's right.
Or take away from the significant impact that things like that can have.
Absolutely. And I do want to say, with all of these policies, the most important work of having a VBAC is listening to your intuition and yourself, right? Because you might decide, like I was in a birth recently and she knew all the things. She's so beyond educated and she chose to have a CTG and her baby ended up being quite unwell during the labor and she had opted for the CTG because she had made the right decision for herself because she was in tune with her intuition and she knew that was the right thing. So if you're walking into that hospital and going, oh, I know all the VBAC, the VBAC page Australia, the Facebook page, fantastic resource, really amazing women in there doing a lot of good community service. They all say I shouldn't have CTG, but I just kind of feel like I want it.
Yeah.
Listen to your gut as well, because you are the only one who has to live with this outcome. And so I can't tell you what is safe and what is not safe. No one can tell you. Not even a doctor can tell you that. Only you know that. So if you feel like you're listening to this and like, oh, well, I'm just going to not have a cannula because they said that I shouldn't because of mobility and whatever, but I kind of feel like I want it. Yeah. Listen to yourself.
Yes.
Birth is as safe as life is. The veil is so thin between the worlds. And so above all, listen to yourself. And if you want an intervention, go and have it.
Yep. And for some women, like, it might be that not having the IV in place or not having the continuous CTG monitoring makes you more stressed. And it's like, obviously, when we're in labor and the biggest thing that makes labor start and progress is oxytocin, right? So that is your happy hormone, your love hormone. You need to be feeling safe and comfortable and confident. Like, that is the hormonal cocktail that we need for labor to progress. And so if Sammy and I are sitting here on the podcast going, oh, be careful about that continuous monitoring and be careful about those IVs. You might not need them. But if you are like, oh my gosh, I am just going to be a puddle of nerves and I'm going to be riddled with anxiety the whole labor if I don't have those things. Oh my gosh, sister, you go and get those things. Exactly what Sammy said. Like, your intuition is so crucial and so important.
And 99.8% of women aren't going to need those things. It's just that 0.2% of women that are going to need a little bit of help. And so, it is definitely the minority there.
Okay, I feel like a couple of other policies that are really important to just call out that I would recommend the woman does some good research into. Early admission to hospital, big one. Being admitted too soon definitely can lead to unnecessary interventions. And that is for so many reasons. I think it kind of flows on to the next thing that I wanted to call out was time limits on labour. That's another policy that often can come up.
What is the policy in New South Wales? Can I interrupt you?
It varies between hospitals, which is really annoying, and so it changes, and it also can vary from woman to woman depending on what her kind of clinical picture is. So it depends on so many factors, like does she have complication A, B, or C, or there's so much that goes into it. I don't know if it's quite stock standard up there. Is it pretty standard?
So we used to have a 1 hour pushing limit at a lot of the public hospitals, but then in September 2020, they brought in the Queensland Clinical Guidelines for VBAC, which were awesome. The Queensland ones were really, really good. And I don't think they do that. I have not seen the time limit being mentioned since then. Maybe we just got lucky with good midwives, but so I don't know what the time limits actually are.
Yeah. It's worth, if you're listening to this, it's worth finding out if you are birthing in a hospital, or even if you're having a home birth with a private midwife, like ask your care provider what their specific policies are, because the policies do vary so greatly. Like, there are hospitals across Sydney that don't, and I'm doing air quotation marks, if you're listening you can't see my fingers, they don't allow, in air quotation marks, water birth, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of, because there is so much evidence that supports that water birth is not only safe and reasonable, but it can improve things like your chances of tearing. And, so there's, again, it's this thing that we touched on before around not all hospital policies are based on good evidence, and you need to be mindful of that. You just do. So yes, time limits on labour. I think... Yeah, oftentimes what will happen is that woman will then be told, oh, this is what we call failure to progress. And I saw this post recently by, who was it? It was some amazing midwife who I love. And she posted something along the lines of like, was it failure to progress or was it your failure to wait? Like, that baby would have probably come out, mate. Like,
that's right. And when I had all of my antenatal appointments and things, and if I had to go, I had to go into hospital one time when I was planning my VBAC, and they said, what was your reason for your cesarean? And I said, failure to wait, because that's all it was. It was coercion and failure to wait. And after I had done my doula studies and I'd been working in the space and it was just so clear to me what had happened. Yeah, and that's probably for a lot of women. And, if you go in for that induction, a really common one is you go in for the induction and it's not really doing anything. Women will go, I don't even really feel it. Whatever. And they get to 3 centimeters. But you are on such a time limit when that synto starts that if you reach the 12-hour limit, they're going to say, oh, that didn't work. And now you've had all these drugs. So the safest thing now for you is to have a cesarean. So just be really mindful of that.
I love that you've brought up induction too. It was one of the things on my list to talk about. Routine induction, I can't even summarize how much I cannot stand care providers trying to convince women to have an induction for no freaking reason. It does my head in, because the research shows, and especially when they try and convince the woman that it's this very safe, very reasonable thing that is not likely to increase their chances of having a cesarean. Not true. It is likely to increase the chance that you'll have a cesarean. And of course, there is a place for induction of labor. Sometimes it is absolutely warranted. And yes, sometimes it certainly is the safest thing for you or the baby or both of you. So I'm absolutely not saying that there's no place for it. I'm not someone who's anti-medical intervention whatsoever. Like, my baby's literally having surgery next week. Like, there is a place for medical intervention, right? So I'm not saying otherwise. But another thing on my list to really focus on is that routine inductions, just be careful. Just make sure that you ask questions. If this is something that is being pitched or suggested, I would be asking, is there a medical diagnosis here? There are so many specific questions that I recommend my clients ask, and there's a whole strategy that I teach them around how to determine, is this a medically warranted induction, or is this just convenient for the hospital and its policy and its protocol? But I think a routine induction, just because we may as well get the baby out, be very, very, very mindful and careful.
And that's where a lot of the women who are listening to this who have had a prior cesarean, that's why they're here, right?
Yep.
And in 2018, we had the ARRIVE trial drop in America, and we say it takes 15, 17 years for new evidence to be brought into hospital. When that trial was released, this induction rate went up by 40% the next month. So it's just very biased on what will be implemented. But be very careful, because I've sat in hospital appointments with people and the obstetricians actually printed out the ARRIVE trial and brought it in.
Yeah.
But it will say it lowers your chance of cesarean. The base validity of that trial is not applicable to Australian hospitals. Okay,
Yeah.
Be very careful. It started with a 22% cesarean rate and it dropped it to 18.5 or something. What hospital in Australia has a 22% cesarean rate? Because I want to send all of my clients there.
Yes.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
That hospital is not working the same as the Australian hospitals. One of our public hospitals has a 51% cesarean rate right now. And that's just mind-blowing to me. Overall, what is the stat? 41% cesarean, I think. So we are in a very scary time for, our oxytocin levels as a species, and we just have to be very mindful. We could go on to so many tangents from here, but just if you are a first-time mum, and I really love when first-time mums listen to VBAC stories, because those women have learnt so much. Yeah. And if you're a first-time mum listening to this and you're being offered an induction, like you said, be very careful. Why are you being offered this? Do you actually have preeclampsia, or is it just a time thing? Is your doctor going away on holidays?
Yep, very important, very, very important. And I'll just really quickly rattle off 3 more, and then let's get into how we can improve our odds. So I think another thing to just be a little bit mindful around is a big baby diagnosis via ultrasound. It's important that you know that those can be quite inaccurate, but then even though there is this understanding that they have quite a significant inaccuracy. I think it's about 15% either way. So let's say baby's measuring at 4 kilos on your scan. That baby might be as big as 4.6, but they also might be as small as 3.4. So just be a little bit aware of the fact that you may be recommended a cesarean or an induction for this big baby, but we don't actually know how big your baby is. Until that baby comes out and we can actually weigh them, we don't know how big your baby is. So that's one to be aware of. Arbitrary pushing positions, massive. The amount of hospitals that will encourage lying flat on your back, it's not ideal for birth. Gravity's not helping you. It's more convenient for the care provider, which is not a reason to be using that position. The other thing is limited access to water birth, which I mentioned before. There are still hospitals around where I am that don't, air quotation marks, allow water birth. You certainly can get in the bath and say, no, I'm not getting out. That's your right. No one's going to handcuff you and pull you out the bath.
Do you know what? Can I just say a story?
Yeah.
I'm supporting a VBAC here, and we had signed off. So to have a VBAC in water, even though it's in our clinical guidelines that you can do it, we still have to sign it against medical advice form. And she'd signed it off, and we got into the hospital. We'd changed rooms to have a bath, and then the obstetrician said, no, you cannot get in there. And then he told me, and I said, that's ridiculous. Why? It's in the clinical guidelines. He said, the solicitors of Queensland Health are on the phone. They are telling me that she cannot get in the bath. So sometimes the powers that be, and this comes back to the naughty girls. How dare you get in the bath and have a baby? What a load of bollocks.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. But yes, no, I do think the limited access to water birth is huge. Like, we know that water immersion reduces pain, it lowers intervention rates. There's so much to be said around that. So yes, I think we rattled off about 8 policies there that you do need to be really mindful of and do research into, and all of those resources that Sammy and I have just said, the Hazel Keatle stuff, the Dr. Kirsten Small things, the Great Birth Rebellion podcast by Melanie the midwife, who is a midwife with her PhD. Amazing resources. Make sure that you get really informed on those things. And then let's talk about how we can improve our odds. This is why people are here. So what can we do to give ourselves the best shot?
There's a couple of big things, right? Continuity of care. Get a known midwife. Is at MGP? Is it a private midwife? Get a doula. I had both, private midwife and a doula. You know, my husband works for a not-for-profit. I'm a birth doula. Mate, we are not loaded. So when I had my first cesarean, I started from that time squirreling away money because I knew I'm going to need at least $10,000 for what I want for my birth. And we can't just pull that out in 9 months, all right? So you have to be intentional. What do you value? I know a doula and I know a private midwife is a lot of money for some families. Be intentional. Ask at your mother blessing or your baby shower for funds towards it, that kind of thing. I know we're in COSI Lives right now. Everyone is struggling, so be intentional with that. Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it's so common that people will just say like, oh, it's too expensive, we can't afford it. But I have seen so many people say that, and then it's like they're buying new clothes every 2 weeks, or going away on fancy baby moons, or having dinner out on a weekly basis, or like their pram is brand new. And it's like, you know, can you really not afford it, or are you just not being super intentional with where your money's going?
Yes.
And the other thing too is like, mate, birth trauma is expensive.
Yes.
Like, I've been there. It was expensive. Psychologist sessions are expensive. Pelvic floor physio sessions are expensive. The babysitting to attend those sessions, like all the things that people don't realize that come after a rough birth. That's expensive. So choose your heart, you know. It's the same idea as people being like, oh, you know, it's a bit expensive to pay for a gym membership and to like pay for healthy food. But it's like, choose your heart. Do you want to, it's hard to invest in a gym membership and a healthy food. But it's also going to be hard to invest in medical bills one day when you've got some disease that you probably could have prevented. Like, choose your heart. I love that saying.
Yeah. As she binds herself. Was that
exactly.
Ashley? Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. The doula thing, I think, is so important. And I think, like, honestly, looking at these other little tidbits of advice that I think are good to give to improve your odds of getting your VBAC, a doula can help you do everything that we're about to talk about more effectively and more efficiently, because we are doing this every day. Like, this is our bread and butter. the research shows that doulas improve birth outcomes, and specifically for this episode, I think the biggest stat to pull on is the fact that there is research that shows that having a doula on your birth team decreases the likelihood that you will end up having a cesarean by 50%, 50. That is massive. Like that, I just don't know how you can hear that statistic and go, oh, nah.
Yeah, that's massive. Yeah, but also you have to do the work yourself. So you cannot have a private midwife and a doula and then just think you're going to wing it and it's going to be okay. You have to do the inner work and you have to find your motivation for this because, birth is hard, right? It's a good hard. It's a place where you grow and it's amazing, but it's really hard. And so if you're not doing the work and you're expecting others to do it for you, just to be really blunt, it's not going to happen. Yeah. And so connecting with your intuition, finding your motivation for this VBAC, connecting with your intuition is my number one. You could honestly have a birth in your bathroom with no one if you've connected with your intuition and you have that self-belief and you know that's the safest thing for you.
Yeah, intuition is massive. I think it really is. And because of what we were talking about before, where we doubt ourselves so often, or we do take on Auntie Karen or Uncle Bob or whoever's advice, and we so often are very quick to make decisions that reflect other people's ideals or what they think is best. Like, I think when you were pregnant, this is one of my things I wrote down to say, preparing your mind and your body are so important because you have to learn to back yourself and make your own decisions. And this is a skill that will carry through into your mothering. Like, there will always be someone as you go through life who disagrees with you. You might choose to breastfeed and there'll be someone who goes, why don't you just give that baby a bottle? You might choose to sleep train and there's someone who goes, why are you traumatizing your baby? You might choose to homeschool or public school and there's going to be someone who disagrees. Like, you've got to get comfortable with making your own decisions and tapping into your own sense of like, okay, what is it that is going to be best for me and my family? And I think that's huge. And then like on the preparing your body point, things like optimal maternal positioning, doing those stretches, even like I am such a big fan of optimal maternal positioning. It's something that after I studied as a doula, I went and did some extra sort of training in that because I just have found it to be really valuable. I've seen it prevent a lot of cesareans. Like, I mean, how many people can you think of? I can think of so many people who have said, oh, I had a cesarean because my baby was breech. Like, it's like, let's not even go there.
Oh, we could do a whole episode on that one. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And it's like, I've been in so many situations where we have done all the things, we've done the OMP, and I've come away from that birth going, gosh, that would have very likely ended up in a cesarean had we not done X, Y, Z at the right moment. And I think you're kidding yourself if you think that you can just have your partner, your boyfriend, your husband, your friend, your mum at your birth. Oh, she's going to be my doula. He's going to be my doula. They're going to be my support. That is amazing that they are going to be a source of support to you. And a doula will never and should never try to replace the role of your partner or your mum or whoever it might be, because their relationship with you is so different and so unique. And there is, it's important that you have that person there. But I'm so sorry. They probably are not an expert in birth. Do they know how to pick up on the fact that your baby may be in a bit of an unfavorable position? And if they know how to pick up on that, do they know how to then address it?
Or have the confidence to do so.
Absolutely. And the confidence to do so when the midwife is saying, oh, just get on your back. Or, oh, we need to pull the forceps out here. Are they really going to back themselves in that moment to say, hey, do you know what? I actually reckon the baby is in position XYZ. If we can just move mum into ABC, then we might have a good chance here. Like, are they going to have the confidence to do that? And the other thing is like even the advocacy. Like, you need someone to advocate for you really well, because like it's just the reality. The odds, unfortunately, are not massively in your favor, and you've got to go in there having everything you can set in place to give yourself the best chance. And I think too, like on the I don't want to pay for a doula thing, people I think often worry, like, what if I hire the doula and then I end up having a cesarean anyway?
Good
oh
point.
My gosh. Would you not rather come out of that birth knowing that you did absolutely everything in your power and control? Because there is a lot in your power and control, right? You get to decide how well researched you are. You get to decide where you give birth. You get to decide on your model of care. Obviously, there are financial limitations. I totally acknowledge that. But there is a lot
that you can do. And there is a lot that is in your control. Can you decide whether your baby genuinely goes into serious distress? No, you don't get to decide that or control that. Of course not. But if you are giving yourself the best possible environment, remember that statistic, that if women are in a favorable environment and everything is set up for them in a really positive way that is conducive to this VBAC happening, we should be seeing a rate of up to 80% VBACs. And yeah, like do the things, put the things in place. Don't walk out of your birth wondering like, man, had I hired the doula, I wonder if that could have gone differently. Like just don't do that to yourself.
And Hazel Keetal's research, she found that women who maybe they had a repeat cesarean, that's okay, but the ones who left feeling good about their births felt supported, heard, and safe. And having a doula can really help with that, especially if you're in fragmented care. Yeah, so I would just say definitely having someone in there that's respectful of your wishes is going to limit that potential trauma. Because the way that you have this baby, honestly, a lot of VBAC work is how can I be okay with having a repeat cesarean? Because you need to surrender. Sometimes these babies just want to be born a different way. And you might want that VBAC with all your heart. But as long as you felt like you were in control, you made the decision to go into theatre, then you will come out feeling good. And so I've supported, I support mostly VBAC women. So my statistic, I don't have a statistic because I don't do cesareans, but I certainly don't have a 94% VBAC rate. And what we do when we go in for repeat cesareans with clients is make sure that they have autonomy in the theatre. So I've had a couple who have had lotus births during their cesareans. So that's a way to take back control. And then they were able to cut the cord in recovery in a beautiful ceremony, which was calm. And their partner got to do it in a calm way. We have women who have done the vaginal seeding, and that's how they felt like they got control back. So just have a really bloody good cesarean plan as well, so that if you do end up on that pathway, you feel really good coming out of that.
Yeah, it's huge. Oftentimes, birth trauma isn't necessarily outcome specific. Like a lot of it is, and the birth trauma inquiry shows this, so Melanie Jackson from the Great Birth Rebellion came on my podcast a couple of weeks ago, and we spoke about this exact thing where she was like, in my 16 years as a midwife, honestly, I have seen that it is not forceps and vacuums and cesareans and epidurals and episiotomies that cause birth trauma. It is the way that women are treated. It is like, did you feel like everything was your choice? Did you know what all of your options were at every single point in time? Were you the one who was making decisions based on those options? That is so much more what makes for a great birth. It's actually more about how you were treated and how you feel, and were you respected and cared for really beautifully during that process, or were you not? And to your point, like even if you end up in a repeat cesarean, having a doula by your side is likely, and do you know what? That's what the research says. So I'm just going to say it is. Having a doula by your side is going to mean that is far less traumatic and far more positive. Like that is what the studies have shown about doula support. And there are so many benefits that we could rattle off. But I do think, it's a no-brainer. Like it really is a no-brainer. And then some other things. So we've touched on hire a doula, choose your care provider really wisely, choose your model of care wisely. I think, knowing the statistics at your specific hospital, if you're giving birth in hospital, like some hospitals, I know there's like a 10% VBAC rate versus, whatever. So really weigh up like the different hospitals in your area, preparing your body, make sure that you've got someone who can teach you all of these OMP protocols and who is aware of that stuff and how to do it. Prepare your mind, doing the work, addressing your fears, really making sure that you are in a good place emotionally and mentally. And then I think too, like understanding hospital policies, all of the ones that we've rattled off before, like make sure that you really are going into it totally across, like when are each of these policies something that, are likely to be helpful and necessary versus when is it just for the convenience of the hospital, or maybe it's not even more convenient. It's just like what it says in the policy book. So then it's just what happens. Like, really get yourself clear on what those things are. And you'll be well on your way to getting that VBAC. And anyone listening to this, I really send you so much love, because I know it's a mountain that you're climbing. It really is. And it's no small thing.
And it should be. It should be a very small thing. It should be a very casual thing. Like in Finland, the women are counselled if they don't want a vaginal birth after cesarean, they send them off to be counselled on the fears around birth, and then that country has a 45% VBAC rate, because the women are just counselled in the way that that's what you'll do. You'll just have a VBAC after a cesarean. And when the women are counselled in this country in just such an unethical way, and that's what makes it hard. It's not the actual birth. It is just birth. Your body, the majority of your bodies can do it,
Yeah.
I think the World Health Organization says, 11% cesarean is like a normal rate. So, you've got a really good chance of doing it. It's just who's in your room. That is a huge part of it.
Honestly, it's like the saying, you are what you eat. Like, you definitely are what you eat. And we should actually add that on to the what can you do to give yourself good odds. Like, in the kind of prepare your body section, do all the OMP, but also like make sure that you're eating well, make sure you're nourishing yourself. Like, all of these things, oopsie, my alarm, because I got to go see clients. All of these things add up, and yeah, I mean, there's so much else that we could go into around how to prepare your body for birth. And this is like, I do literally a whole session on this with my clients. We spend a full session all about how to prepare for birth, because it's massive. But I think, the takeaway from this is that VBAC, unfortunately, doesn't just happen in Australia. It just doesn't. And it does take planning, it does take advocacy, and it certainly takes the right team around you. So if you're serious about this and you're like, I really want this VBAC, it means everything to me, then get educated, get the right care provider, get that doula, like, just do it. Give yourself the best chance at this, and
couldn't agree more.
Mic drop.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? Like, who wants to recover from a cesarean with a toddler?
No, not me.
Like, it is a huge, huge driving factor for women to have VBACs, because you have to parent 2 children at the end of this or more.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
100%. I've had so many clients actually who are like, do you know what? Like, I would love to have the VBAC just for the rite of passage and the experience of like what a vaginal birth is like. And that means a lot to me. I want to experience that. But they've said to me, that's like 30% of it. And the other 70% is that I just can't be bothered to be recovering from a major surgery with a toddler in tow. And I totally
the practicalities of it are massive. And then also birth, family planning. Do you want 4 kids? Because, then your best bet is to have that VBAC after the first cesarean.
Yeah.
You got even more of a fight for VBAC after 2 cesareans and 3, although you can absolutely do it.
Yes. But it's more of a fight. Exactly. So it's like, just put all the right things in place. And if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, but I've already had 3 cesareans, all the more, like, get the doula this time so that you're not trying to have a VBAC after you've had 4 cesareans.
Absolutely. And go on to the VBAC support group Australia on Facebook. There's plenty of stories of VBAC after 3 cesareans and more. So women definitely do it, and it can be safe. Is it safe for you? That's what you'll have to ask yourself.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a rating or a comment, and I can't wait to see you back here for the next one.